and thanks to the Urban Land Institute for partnering with us and hosting these two workshops. And we know that ULI does some really important work in Boston and really nationally. So I'm Vineet Gupta. I'm the Director of Planning at the Boston Transportation Department. I think I probably know almost everybody in the room, but I have to say that you are a representation of the community that makes development move forward in Boston. And you are critical to that. And we really are very appreciative of you taking time to join this conversation. So thank you. At the city, we also know that you support policies that are both, or really simultaneously, climate friendly as well as development friendly. And we know that those two things can very easily go hand in hand to make Boston a better place to live in, a better place to work in. And so thank you for that understanding as well. We also know at the city that our policies will only be effective if we make them with you and for you. And that kind of is a good segue into the purpose of these two workshops. So if you move into the next slide, Allah. The purpose today really is to familiarize all of you, and I know that your peers in the development community, in the transportation consultant community, there may be a few architects as well here in the room, real estate brokers, that all of you, we want to familiarize you with some recent thinking that we are doing to make the development review process in the city more effective. And we'll go into that in a little bit of detail. And really, as I was suggesting, we want to get insight and feedback on what we've done so far. And this is particularly to do with work that relates to parking ratios that some of you might be familiar with because you've participated in previous forums, as well as how we look at bicycles and incorporate them in the development review process. But we also want, that will be in the workshop today, but we also want to, in the subsequent workshop, introduce and get some feedback from you on a new dimension that we're adding to our development review approach, which is to have kind of a flexible point system for transportation demand management. I do want to take this opportunity to commit, as we have done for years, that your feedback will inform our work, that your feedback will help us make changes so that our final policies are effective. So we've taken a whole new approach, not a whole new approach, but we have started to kind of revamp how the transportation department does development review. And essentially, we want to simplify the process so that it's easier for all of you to participate. And to do that, we know that we have to provide some consistency. We have to provide certainty so that you have less kind of ambiguities about decision making and about being able to move forward. And particularly in this day and age, we want to make the entire process as transparent as possible. So all of us, as well as the public, have access to what we are doing. So as many of you know, for the last, I would say, 25 years, our access plan agreement process has been paper-based. And I think it's about time we came into the 21st century and made the whole process online. And that's something that we are hoping to accomplish this year. If we're able to get our process online, we know that it'll be easier for us to provide clear guidelines in advance of the application process, in advance of writing the specifics of a transportation access plan agreement. It also will give us an opportunity to talk about mitigation, which I know that all of you are in discussions with us, seemingly every week, for those discussions to be slightly more structured and less negotiated in general. And I know that all of you will appreciate that because that will get some certainty in the process. Regarding transparency, we really want to make sure that the public, particularly the neighborhood in which your development might be, is kind of aware of what's going on. And as a first step, we have already made every TAPA that's been executed since the 1980s online, and we'll talk about that in a minute as well. Finally, I do want to say that we coordinate with the BPDA. Some would say over-coordinate. We meet with them practically every day. But we want to actually further improve that coordination, not only with the BPDA, but also with the ISD. When you get your foundation permit or your building permit, is that timely relative to BPDA approval and BTT approvals, and also with the Environment Department, so that many of you know that the Environment Department is responsible for the parking freeze, and there's a pretty good overlap, which we should try and sort out as well. So those are kind of the dimensions of how we'd like to simplify the process. We hope that this will work for you. And so if you go to the next slide, all of this is driven by kind of larger macro goals. And I'll start with the middle one. And I think that Boston has joined cities across the nation to, with the goal of being net neutral relative to emissions by 2050. And this is driving much of our thinking. It's also driving related Go Boston 2030 targets. Again, in this case, by 2030, these are aspirational targets so that we have a direction in which we'd like to go, which essentially say that we want to improve transit ridership by a third, biking fourfold, and this would really mean that drive-alone rates would have to come down by half. But how we do that, we can only kind of accomplish those goals if we improve the other options. If there's more investment in transit, if there's more investment in biking, and if there's more investment in electric vehicle infrastructure. And so you might have noticed the city of Boston has started to kind of really ramp up and accelerate our participation and our investments in those modes of travel. So that's kind of the macro policy that drives most of what our on the ground work is. I'm not sure if Jonathan Greedy was able to join, and he and I have been talking at the BPDA. He and I have been talking extensively, and I just want to say that the BPDA, particularly the development review side, is very much in the loop, and we are working in close cooperation with them so that you get a unified access to our work for you. Maybe John said that he wasn't sure if he could make it. He had another calendar appointment, but anyways, I'm going to hand it over next to Allah Muqahal, who is been with the department for a year and a half, and or maybe more. Sorry if I only got a year and a half in there, but it looks like you've been here for a long time, Allah. But she is kind of directing all this work. She's project managing it. She's the person that moves things along. So I want to give a shout out to Allah and hand over the meeting to her to go through the agenda, if that works for everybody. Michelle, I was just asking, where are you entertaining comments in chat while this goes on, or do you just want us to go through the presentations and then kind of do that open question and answers?
Yeah, I think we have a couple of segments in the agenda for Q&A. So I'm happy to answer any questions that come in either to me as a private chat or general questions, but we do have time in the agenda. So please feel free to save your questions for those times.
Thanks so much, Michelle, and Allah, it's all yours.
Thank you for the background and introduction, Vineet, and thank you everyone for coming today. So today we're going to cover a number of topics in transportation development review. We'll have time for an open Q&A, and then you will be divided into breakout rooms, into 3 breakout rooms facilitated by myself, William Moose from BTD, and Sam Devine from the BPDA. We'll do an interactive exercise, and then we'll come back all together and do a share out. Today's presentation, as indicated by Vineet, will be a foundation that will help jumpstart the TDM point system workshop on the 23rd. So this has been up for a while, but I wanted to bring this to everyone's attention. BTD's Transportation Development Review website. We have developed it, and it serves as a one-stop shop for all things transportation development review. It includes a map and database of all executed TAPAs, links to guidelines and tools and resources. And this is where everything that I cover today it's already either on there already, or it will be on there eventually. And that includes everything from the EV policies, bike policies, and parking policies. So one of the few guidelines we've recently released to kind of help streamline development review is the bicycle level of traffic stress. And the website is here. It's also linked to in the Transportation Development Review website. Bicycle level of traffic stress, essentially, what it does is that it's a map that assigns a score for every road segment in Boston. And the scores show how stressful a roadway's traffic is on bicyclists. The scoring ranges from 1, the least stressful, to 4, the most stressful. And the idea is that when there's a development or a project, a developer or a city project manager will be able to go in and get a sense of how stressful these the roads in the study area are. The point isn't to make sure that every single roadway in Boston is an LTS1. The point is we want to create a network of safe, low stress roadways and pathways for bicyclists for them to be able to get from point A to point B. Just like how there's a transit network, there needs to also be a bike network. That is the point of that. And it's pretty it's a pretty well developed, well thought out analysis. We developed it with tool. It's based on multiple factors that contribute to the stress level of roadway traffic on bicyclists. That includes traffic speed, average daily traffic volume. Those numbers come from the MassDOT roadway file, if you're familiar with it. The number of lanes in each direction, and conflict factors such as zoning conflicts, key bus route conflicts, pickup or drop off zones, or if it's in a school zone. So if essentially what the conflict factor is, it's a binary, and it registers 1 if there's at least 1 conflict factor from any of these conflicts. And so if one or more of these criteria is met, if there's a conflict factor, the LTS score is increased by 1 point. Multiple criteria do not increase the score by more than the initial 1 point, but because land uses change along the street, this may cause the LTS score to vary from block to block along an otherwise consistent street. This table kind of helps. It looks a little complicated. It's pretty direct. If we look at the left-hand column where it says vehicle volumes, you can see as the vehicle volumes increase, the presence of a parking lane, the presence of a bike lane, what is the speed, the posted speed, all these things impact the LTS. And the idea here is that we want projects, roadways, that lead to and from developments, roadways along corridors to have at least an LTS2, a level of traffic stress 2, or a traffic stress that's bearable for most cyclists of most abilities and ages. And so you can see here that it might be that you're on a roadway and it's leading to a development, and it might make more sense to say reduce the speed on a roadway to shift it from an LTS3 to an LTS2. So that might include things like implementing traffic calming measures, or things that will help reduce the speed, or maybe it includes a bike lane. You know, it's understandable. Not every, you know, Boston roadway is going to be able to accommodate a protected bike lane, right? Obviously. But the idea is to kind of help structure the conversation around the bike network and how people get to and from a development safely, and on a low stress network. So this is one of the things that we've developed. The website is pretty comprehensive. We have included a full detailed methodology, data dictionary. You can download the GIS file. And if there is anyone here whose team may want to do a deeper dive into that, I'm very happy to do that as well. The other thing that we've recently released is how to do traffic counts during a pandemic. And so we're allowing using old counts for areas that have seen significant change in traffic patterns. And so using old nearby counts, using our online traffic counts database. You can go back as far as 2015. And if no nearby counts are available, user-generated data may be used. Of course, all of this, all methodologies that use old observations or data must be reviewed and approved by the BTD. And the other thing that we did in traffic counts is we've removed compounded vehicle growth rates. And what that is, it's essentially the 0.5% that's added to vehicle counts year after year annually. And we've removed that because if it's not associated with new development, we don't want to say arbitrarily, this is how much we think vehicle growth is going to happen, because just from looking at the data that we have on our streets, the vehicle growth is there's a huge variation. There's sometimes it increases, sometimes it decreases. It depends on many factors, and that 0.5% is only applied to vehicles. It doesn't get applied to transit riders. It doesn't get applied to bicyclists and peds. So we will no longer be using background vehicle growth rates. However, we still obviously will be using forecasted trip generation rates for new developments. And we expect, of course, developers and project managers to include trip generates by new developments for all modes, not just vehicles. Right. Okay, this brings us to the meat of the conversation, which is the maximum parking ratio rates. And I know several folks have already seen this. We've been doing a lot of stakeholder engagement. We've been looking and reviewing and reassessing them. And so I kind of want to go over where we're at now with parking ratios. And near the end of this, Vineet will kind of give an overview of the timeline that we're thinking of. Look, the reality is that transportation emissions have not decreased. Where there's been progress on the building side, not so much on the transportation side. Transportation accounts for 29% of our emissions. It accounted for 29% of our emissions in 2018. And emissions have not decreased since 2005, mostly because of rising vehicle miles traveled. Rising VMT rates have increased. And so we really have seen more or less stagnant emission rates. Where are people coming? Most people that are driving to and from Boston, most of the people that are driving to Boston are driving to a few census tracts in Boston. This is drive alone rates by employment location. This was derived from tax information and from the census. And essentially pre-COVID, most of the people drive alone to work in Boston, drive to areas with the most transit options. And so the deep red census tracts in downtown and LMA, you know, those account for, you know, there's a particular census tract in downtown where 16,000 people drove alone to work. And if we are starting to think about what does, you know, hopefully when we have, when hopefully the pandemic is done and it's safe for buildings to be occupied at 100% again, what are the trends that we can expect? And if we end up with more people driving to areas that are the most transit rich in New England, we're just going to have absolutely terrible congestion problems, even worse than before, and we simply just can't afford that. In a recent survey we conducted with ABC of mostly downtown Seaport and LMA employees, more commuters indicated they plan to drive post-pandemic than before. My colleague just posted a link to the commuter survey. ABC is also doing a focus groups with about a dozen employers to kind of get a sense of where employers are at. And right now what's happening is there's a de-densification of the office. But chances are that post-pandemic, you know, hopefully after everyone's vaccinated and social distancing guidelines are lifted, you know, and people are operating at 100%, you know, employees are already saying they're expecting to drive more, and we just can't have more congestion. And we need to take measures to prevent an increase in congestion. Parking is also expensive. Like, so, you know, the rule of thumb for underground parking, according to the BPDA, is about $100,000 per parking space. Construction costs, you know, the costs that you see are also based on a construction cost report. For above ground parking, it ranges between about 30 and 45. For underground parking, 33 and 52. But again, the rule of thumb for BPDA is about 100K per parking space. That's a lot of money. And so, and the reality is that a single underground parking space in Boston costs more than the most expensive financial incentive program or TDM program. And so, and the thing with these costs is they don't just go away. They get passed down to tenants, right? The cost of garage parking to renters is about $1,700 per year. If you haven't seen it, there's a MAPC perfect fit parking report that was released maybe about a year ago, where they showed using, you know, data from Boston and the Boston region that parking, we overbuild parking essentially by about 30%. And for affordable housing, it's the parking utilization rates in residential buildings is actually even lower. So, you know, the parking is about, for affordable housing tenants, about the parking rates is about 0.55 parking spaces per unit are used in an affordable housing rate. So it's even less than non-affordable market rate housing unit. And so, you know, less parking means less cars, less congestion, less emissions. It means, hopefully it will mean more affordable housing. It's also a policy that's just going to be in adherence with Go Boston Mode Shift goals, with our carbon-free Boston emissions goals. The reality is just parking availability, especially free parking, is by far the single greatest determinant of whether someone will drive to work. There isn't a single incentive or driving reducing program that can compete with free parking. And so, and you know, the new ratios that I'm about to show you, I think it's important to remember, it only applies to buildings that are over 50,000 square feet. That's one. And two, it only applies to net new parking spaces. So if there's a development and there's 50 parking spaces and they want to build 50 more, we're only counting 50, not 100. So that's also important to remember. But the thing is that we need to target areas that are transit rich. And so developments that are located in walkable, transit rich areas should build less parking. That's what these maximum parking ratios are saying. It's also, we've had many conversations, many Stakeholder engagements, we've worked with BPDA, we've worked with transportation consultants, developers, brokers to kind of get their feedback on this, and we've changed the ratios just a little bit. So what you see today is a result of that. What are these ratios based on? They're based on all the things that make an area walkable, an area accessible. And so if a parcel has a high accessibility, has a high number of jobs that are accessible by transit in 30 minutes, has a high walk score, is close to grocery stores, close to rapid transit, close to key bus routes, commuter rail, bike share stations, car share stations, then it's going to have the least amount of parking. That's the idea, and that's what parking should be based on. So this is the map. When we did the analysis, we came up with a scoring system. The higher the score, it's a scoring system based on 0 to 100 to make it, much more understandable. The higher the score, the lower the maximum parking ratio, and the lower the score, the higher the maximum parking ratio. All it means is that more transit options means less parking, right? More options, period. It's not just transit. It's also like, can you get to a grocery store pretty quickly? Can you, is it a walkable neighborhood? Is it a walkable area? And so, we're trying to capture different criteria to capture different types of trips, not just work trips, right? And so the map is exactly as you would expect it, right? The downtown, Back Bay areas have the highest scores and therefore the least amount of parking. The outer neighborhoods, or Lower East Dorchester, all have the lowest scores, which means more parking. And the idea is that this is meant to be a dynamic map. So every year we'll update it based on updates to the infrastructure, right? If there's more bike share stations, if there's maybe updated key bus routes, maybe whatever it is, that's the idea. What we are planning to do is pilot it. So it's not going to be immediately written in concrete. And we want to pilot it because we want to see how it actually plays out in real life. Just to kind of give you a sense of how the new ratios compare to developments that recently were approved. Parcel 12, the negotiated and approved parking ratio is about 0.23 on average. It's 150 spaces. The new parking ratio under the new guidelines, gives them a little bit more leeway. So these are maximums. It doesn't mean you have to hit the ceiling immediately. But this fits the bill. Alston Yards is a little bit more, it's a little bit more complicated, right? On average, it has a ratio of 1. And the new parking ratio under the new guidelines, it's 0.75 to 1 for residential, 0.75 to retail, 0.75 to office. It's not that far off. And as you can see, there's definitely a difference between where the previous development was in Back Bay versus the new development that has, versus the Alston development, which has lower scores and therefore a little bit more parking. I'm going to hand it over to Vineet to kind of review the timeline for how we're going to roll out these ratios.
Thank you, Alla. And yes, so as Alla mentioned, we want to really roll this out as a package. So it's kind of getting more certainty to the development review process by going online. It's about these parking ratios. It's about making sure that the transportation demand management point system is available, which gives flexibility to developers. All of that we will start to roll out in late spring. And this will be after the workshop that we're doing today, obviously, as well as the second workshop that's on February 23rd. Again, as Alla mentioned, the parking ratios, the maximum parking ratios piece is a pilot that we would do for a year. We know that we are in a year that's in transition because of the pandemic, but remember that all these ratios really relate to projects that will be built, not this year, but in coming years. So, but hopefully things will be back to normal. And we'll try and evaluate based on your feedback today and in subsequent conversations. We'll evaluate and determine the policy after the 1-year pilot day. And as we've been doing in the past year, we've been kind of refining and making sure that the maximum parking ratio is actually working. With that, I'm going to, I think we have 10 minutes of question and answers before breakout groups. And between Michelle at ULI and myself, or if Michelle, if you can curate the questions between the city staff, we can try and answer them.
Sure thing. We don't have any questions yet, but feel free to enter your question into the chat box about anything that we just went over in that presentation.
Allah, it might be a good idea to put up the chart that has the actual parking ratios, because that's what people care about the most, as to what exactly is that ratio.
Yep.
And I know that so that people can kind of look at the columns and so for example, if you are in a area that's scoring really high, the 90 to 100, it's that brownish color. If it's residential, we are looking, and if it's a condo, we're looking at a 0.5, and then it goes up all the way to 1.25, the maximum parking ratios, but it's less if it's rental, et cetera, down the chart.
So Carolyn from Skanska has a question. Carolyn, why don't you go ahead and ask your question?
Hi, Vineet. Hi, Ella. Thanks for the presentation. Just a question. I know last time we all met, I think it was probably a year ago at BTD's office, there was a lot of good feedback and I think even afterward, I know we at least provided some additional input. I was curious if you have like a summary or a kind of response to some of those questions, just so we can maybe see how they were addressed, or so we don't have to rehash some of that stuff. That would be super helpful.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So one of the things, I don't have a comparison on me right now, but there's been major changes to the map itself. Brighton has now much lower scores because one of the feedback we heard is that the green line, the above ground green line, is subject to traffic at intersections, even in places where it's kind of separated, and it just doesn't compare to, say, the red line, orange line, or blue line. So we actually, shifted the criteria, shifted the silver line and the above ground green line to a key bus route rather than a subway, which gives it lower scores than the other subway lines. That's something we heard repeatedly, not only from developers, but even from other transportation consultants, brokers. And the result of that is, the Seaport, some of the Seaport, definitely Brighton ends up with lower scores because parts of the Seaport depend on the silver line, other parts of Brighton and also depend on the green line. We've also significantly increased, office, retail, residential. We've divided into rental and condos. Before it was based on number of bedrooms. And the response we received from brokers, again, developers and consultants, was that's not how we sell things. That's not how we do things. It's rentals or condos. And so a condo there's just going to be a higher expectation that if I'm buying a condo that, especially maybe further away from downtown, that I expect a parking space with it. We've changed it from, bedrooms to rental and condos. We've reassessed our R&D and lab space. We've reassessed universities and colleges. We've increased medical clinics. And remember, lower scores, as writing lower scores means higher parking. So we've made, a ton of changes. I'm happy to, send a before and after map, but the map definitely changes. We also wanted to give a little more weight to commuter rail because places in Dorchester do depend on the Fairmount line and do depend on, Hyde Park, same thing. They do depend on the commuter rail. So we also increased the weighting, at least, for those for those as well. And so what you're seeing today is quite different than the map and ratios that I showed about a year ago.
the level of granularity of this map literally goes down to the parcel level. So there's a lot of kind of deep dive thinking that's gone into creating this. And we understand that, as circumstances change, the map will change.
Hi, Vineet. This is Jim Katie. Good to see you after all these years.
Hi.
I see these are maximum ratios. Are there minimum? I mean, oftentimes we're struggling to say to address the minimum number of minimum ratio, and I see maximum here. Is this also going to be interpreted as the minimum?
The answer is no. These are seen as the maximum. So the most amount of parking from a policy perspective that we think is right for a particular part of the city. Remember that this is for projects that are 50,000 square feet and above that are going through an Article 80 review process.
Yep.
So typically the zoning that relates to the Article 80 review process kicks in. I do understand that for smaller projects, which go through the ZBA process, there's decades old zoning that requires minimums, that you should have at least so many parking spaces.
Yeah.
And so that's a kind of I won't call it a conflict, but a kind of mixed message sometimes for developers. And I think that that's something that we're resolving. But remember that for the bigger projects to which this applies, the Article 80 zoning kicks in anyways, which generally supersedes the underlying parking. But yeah, that's a really good question. So you could come in for less parking. You could come in with no parking if you wanted to. Of course, there are the dynamics that go with the presentations that all of you do in the neighborhood, and the dynamics of on-street parking and off-street parking, and what neighborhood residents think. And as everybody in this room knows, that varies a lot from neighborhood to neighborhood throughout the city.
And that's why there's also a range in the ratios themselves in the table. The range is 0 to et cetera. So the minimum being 0 for developments over 50,000 square feet.
Okay, that's very helpful. And it's a struggle in some of the outer neighborhoods because everybody's kind of freaked out about parking, and it's an issue that it's the first thing on everybody's mind. And what I was hoping that would come out of this is some kind of relief from the minimums, in that struggling to meet, like say for example, a 0.75 parking ratio. That's kind of been standard operating procedure for a long time, and it becomes very hard to meet when you're on tighter sites and you have issues relative to underground parking costs associated with it. So I'm hoping that something comes out of this where we're looking at some of the minimums required, because right now a 0.75 is perceived as a minimum, and that becomes very, very hard to achieve.
Thank you. Scott, did you have a question?
Yep. Scott, you're muted.
You're muted.
Too many buttons for my little mind. First, I wanted to say this is really great, and it's producing lots of interesting sort of stuff. What I'm wondering is either when you get through the pilot period or not, how much of the underlying data behind here can and or will be made available. There's a lot of sort of analysis that one could be done, especially as it relates to alternatives that could be done if one could have access to the underlying data that sort of fed into some of this. I know the state is starting to get better about sort of sharing some of their, live traffic data and ridership data, and I'm just wondering how much of this.
Like I said at the beginning, we really want to be as transparent as possible, and we don't want to give the impression that everything goes into a black box and out pops a parking ratio. So all of this data will be made available to you in online, unless Allah tells me that's not possible.
That is absolutely possible, and that is absolutely a priority. And like the bicycle level of traffic stress, which
Yep.
is that data is all available online, you can download it,
Fantastic.
and there's an interactive map that you can zoom in and out and play around with it. We will do the same thing with these ratios. The full methodology, it will be documented in painstaking detail. It will be online. The data itself will be online. Like all of it will be online. Yeah.
That's fantastic. Thank you very much.
Everybody who wants to do a deep dive, all the nerds in the room, particularly the traffic consultants, we'd love for you to analyze our analysis and tell us whether we're on the right path. Other questions? While people are thinking of other questions, I have noticed that Jonathan Greeley has joined the discussion. And as I mentioned at the outset, this is really a partnership between the BTD and BPDA. And John, I had talked about at the start of this conversation that we do think that our policies can be simultaneously go hand in hand, both climate friendly and development friendly, to kind of set a larger macro policy direction. But John, if you'd like to say something, please. Oops.
I apologize. I was just on another call. I would just say I want to compliment Vineet and Allah and the whole interagency team that spent a lot of time on this. And I think it's an attempt to rationalize that there are varying mobility goals and opportunities in different parts of the city. And I think back to the Go Boston opportunity, the Go Boston planning effort that kind of identified the walking city, the transit city, and the car city as kind of concentric circles. And so I think that this work kind of affirms some of the assumptions that came out of that planning. And I would encourage that I did hear some of the Q&A, and I think one point is we've got, using an Alston as an example, we've got examples where we've got residential buildings that are trying to minimize their parking impact to help promote affordability. But I also know in those same neighborhoods we have more commercial-oriented buildings that are trying to push their number of parking spaces. And so we recognize parking has a cost, both purely financial, but also societally, environmentally, and beyond. And so I don't think, I think our goal as a city has been in recent years is to promote mobility as opposed to one form of transportation or the other. And I think this is, a reaction to that, or a necessary next step in the terms of a more deliberate and transparent evaluation of what the appropriate amount of parking is for a master plan for a building. And I think we're really excited to kind of hear people's feedback and see how this kind of it takes life in the coming months. And so I just want to compliment Vineet and Allah, and thanks to ULI for providing a space for significant dialogue on this important issue.
Thanks, John, for getting your team as well to be engaged. We don't see any other questions. I know that we're going to do breakout groups so that we can have a more in-depth discussion. We would really encourage everyone to join those discussions in smaller groups.
Vineet?
And sorry.
Looks like we have one more question from Rusty Martino, and then.
Oh, sorry about that. Apologies.
That's all right. I was trying to figure out when the right time to maybe ask this question. It's maybe too soon for you guys, but as a developer who knows I'm going to have to go into some new development schemes, generally speaking, I would love not to have more parking, but we generally are looking for the parking to satisfy tenants on our commercial buildings. And so what I didn't hear, and maybe I just missed it, is there any route for exception to these policies? Is there any way to say, I've got to have a little bit more? And I say, I don't know if this is the right time to ask that, because who wants to put all the work that you've put into this just to have somebody say, how do I get exception to it? I just want to know if you've contemplated that at all in the process, or is that a stage that will come later on in any way, or is the plan to say, no, guys, we have to try to stick to these ratios?
The point of departure is to say no. So because we really want to have a policy that everybody knows is a policy that's followed through. There will always be kind of, circumstances that are above the normal that for sure we can consider, but as a point of departure, the answer would be that no, these are the maximum parking ratios. And let's start from that. We have, trial ballooned these parking ratios. We've compared them to recent developments in each and every neighborhood to make sure that they're somewhat consistent with what's been proposed in them. And we're very confident that they can actually work, both from the perspective of attracting tenants. And, we've had that conversation with brokers. There's some differences of opinion. We've had that conversation with developers, but some of us and many of us in this room who've been doing this for some time, I should say that most projects are coming in with far less parking than they did, say, like 10 years ago, or even as recently as 5 years ago. The 0.75 is what people are coming in with now. There are some projects that are, as you all know, including the parcel 12 at Mass Ave in Newbury, that's coming in with almost no parking. So there is, we're confident about these ratios, that they work from getting your financing, from getting your tenants, from making it workable. And if you look at the blue area, so to speak, I mean, we know there's no transit over there, and the ratios over there are, as much as 1.25 for residential.
Yeah,
so that was a no and yes answer.
But your answer makes complete sense to me, Vineet, and given the work that you've done to it, I'm not surprised by that. For me, it's hard. It's not a great question if you don't have a specific thing that you're looking at. So I certainly want to give it a try first and make it work. I just for me it's a little bit worse than we've had in the past, but it is sometimes easier to have it in writing the way you guys have given it to us, to say, sorry, tenant, this is where we need to go and we can't get more. So, to that end, it's helpful. I guess the other thing I'm just trying to think it through, like, how am I going to sell this? That if you have uses or tenants that feel like they absolutely have to have this much parking, is it part of your thinking, or is it part of your idea that what you actually want to do is promote that they look in some of these areas with lower scores so that they can get that parking? Or is that not in your thinking in terms of what could be a potential kind of outcome of this? I'm just interested if you ever drew that conclusion from the way it might end up,
Okay. So just to understand your question, are you saying that because of this policy, we'll start seeing more development in areas that doesn't have such good transit access and therefore higher parking ratios? So
I am asking if you guys came to that conclusion. As a developer, I clearly have my own point of view on that. I don't think it's likely. I just want to understand if you actually
we talked about this at one of our stakeholder meetings, and we pretty much came to the same conclusion that we don't think that's going to be a outcome of this approach. As a practical matter, we have been following similar ratios for over 10 years now. It's the first time we're actually formalizing them, but in discussions that we have with developers, we've been talking about these ratios for years. It's just that it wasn't a requirement.
Okay.
But again, if there are special circumstances, we're obviously open to a discussion. I mean, the whole idea here is to provide certainty in the development process and make it easier for all of you to not have to worry about, oh my God, what is City Hall going to tell us?
Hey, Russ, it's a great question. And I think it's central. It's one I certainly asked when Allah brought this, first presented this to me. And I think we did a bit of a roadshow. We did talk to lots of different people at different points in the development cycle, from brokers to developers to some capital markets people. And I think one of the things that I hope allows is maybe consistent with how you're marketing buildings is kind of the approach with there's a rationale. This is not this neighborhood just has X, right? Which is kind of how it's often been handled. This neighborhood has this recommendation because it's the zoning or whatever. I think it's more trying to say, based on the unique aspects of the area you're in, that's what ultimately unlocks the outcome, right? And so if you are located in a transit-rich, walkable place, then you are going to have less parking. But but there's a rationale to it, as opposed to just saying, hey, by the way, the parking ratio in the entire X neighborhood is Y, right? Like in that, and I don't think, because I think if we're updating it, that doesn't make sense. Then when you push back, right? But this has the subtlety to allow that one part of Alston might have one response based on proximity to mobility amenities, and another might be different. And so I think we're trying to have a subtler approach. Look, I think Vineet's point is a really good one. I think imbued in all this is that this is the first time we're trying something like this. We're trying to bring certainty and rationale to the entire city. But obviously, I think we have a track record, both Vineet and myself and others, of we're always trying to learn and evolve over time. So this is going to have to live a little bit in the real world. And I would imagine there'll be feedback over time too, as we kind of see how it goes, right? So I think it's incredibly well considered. I think Allah's work is outstanding on this. And I know it's a team of people, but Allah really kind of is the engine that makes this go. And I think that's the hope, is that we've come up with something that is a fair approach to, at times, what can seem like an arbitrary conversation.
All right, I appreciate it. Thank you, guys.
I see a question from Barbara. Hi, Barbara. Yes, so we will be looking at what it means if the modal priorities in the right of way have been changed, whether it's a bike lane or a bus lane, and in some cases an extra travel lane. Yes, we do that, and typically when we do design a new bike lane or a new bus lane, and you see more and more of those in the coming years, we do look at, on a project by project basis, what the impact on traffic flow is in any event. But yes, in the overall network, we'll be doing it as well.
Thank you.
If the facilitators, or maybe the facilitators, have assigned someone to do maybe a share out of some highlights of the mural exercise that we all did, I'm happy to start with our group. I think people had some really interesting suggestions for questions 1 and 2. Particularly, I think one of the suggestions for what would you like to see in an online application development review website, tools that allow developments and tenants to understand all transportation and parking availability to projects and tenants. One of, another suggestion was, clear standards communicated to stakeholders and community members. In addition to what's currently available, what other resources would be useful? Some interesting posts include access to future planned projects, like future planned bike lanes, and more consistent links with improvements pending with state transportation options, such as commuter rail and MBTA. Another, in the bike parking lot, we also had a few interesting posts, including are there incentives for developers if you have lower parking ratios? I think that's a fantastic question and will be answered in the next workshop. So stay tuned.
Great. Do we want to do room 2 or room 3? Sure, we'll skip to room 3 then. Nick, would you want, as the note taker, to give us a quick recap, or do you want me to tackle it? Me? Okay, he's pointing me. Okay, great. So we actually had some good follow-up conversation. Try to do all this in like a minute and a half, so I'm not going to be able to touch on everything. But we had some good follow-up conversation reflecting on the presentation. There were some questions about, how will the one-year pilot work, and what does that mean for projects that come in and sort of start, getting into the pipeline, while the pilot is in place. So, sort of what, I guess, what reassurances will there be that there won't be sort of major shifts, major changes that will have, disruption to sort of the direction that those projects are moving in, under the pilot. So that was a really good question that we talked about some. There were some comments about the need for more coordination about with the APCC process for projects that are in the parking freeze area, particularly with respect to the city's EV requirements. For question 1, there was also some folks wanted to see like a map-based application process, which I think I can say is part of the objective, right? To have this be parcel-based and map-based. There were a couple of comments as well about the bike parking guidelines actually as well, and some good sort of constructive criticism of the bike parking guidelines as well. But we only have 1 minute left, so I'm going to shut up now and let the last group share out.
We had some great conversations too in group number 3. We had a question about with lab space that sometimes comes in for different uses. Is it more of a traditional lab or a wet lab or commercial, and how does the parking ratio apply with the building that kind of fluxes with uses? Another question we had for question 1 with the online application support is the ability to chat with a planner function rather than sending a formal email with a bunch of people CC'd, but maybe having something a little bit more just a quick response type of deal. And then another question of if a garage can convert to different uses, how is it counted differently? Some of these really particular nuanced situations, how do these policies apply? Question 2 for what's currently available and what other resources would be useful. We had maybe case studies by neighborhood listed out on the website. I know we will get into some case studies, but yeah, very, very great suggestion. Supporting information on transit, bike, and traffic counts. And then someone requested a bike share station location plan by neighborhood. So yeah, we had some really great feedback, really, really engaging discussion. And with that, I will pass the baton back over.
Yeah, I think another really great question that came up is how are we thinking about the edges of where the city interacts with other cities? So how, if Watertown has more parking and it gives them a more competitive advantage, what does that mean for the city? I think these are all really great questions, and we'll turn everything into a PDF, including the presentation, to send it over to Michelle, who will send it to everyone else.
Hey, Alaa, on that point, it strikes me that, and we may want, and you may have this, but as part of the conversation, I'm thinking about Russ's earlier question, which gets at the core of this, is that are we trying to influence decisions about where people go? Is like, hey, go to Hyde Park because you can have 2 parking spaces per 1,000 square feet. I don't think that's what we're trying to do, but I do think, do we have some information we can share on what, say, Arsenal Yards is charging for, or has for a parking ratio? What is the kind of standard approach that both Somerville and Cambridge have? I think I would imagine Somerville and Cambridge both have fairly similarly progressive approaches or attempted approaches. And so what is our competition looking at? And I don't competition is the wrong way of looking at it, but because I do think a rising tide from an employment perspective in all those communities is good for the city. That being said, it might be good to know how other adjacent cities that are viewed as competitive are doing. So if you're developing on Western Ave in Alston, you are in a small submarket of competition between Watertown and Western Ave, right? And I think there's lots of reasons why you still choose Western Ave, even if the parking ratio is 0.75 versus 1.5. But we should understand that how the neighborhood, the boundaries of regulation impact things too.
Because we are rapidly losing a lot of people, I just want to say 3 quick commitments from the city. One is that, as Allah mentioned, we will document all your questions and document your comments and share that with everybody on our list, so you know that we've heard you. The second is that there was a discussion about doing a working group that would focus on this whole dilemma about life sciences space, office, wet lab. We've had some conversations on that, but we want to do a little working group, so you'll hear about that. The third piece is, and I'm kind of saying this off the cuff, and I know that we can commit to doing a session like this at least once every year, so that everybody can get up to speed and stay in touch. But feel free to contact any of us directly as well. Thanks.
I just want to remind everyone, our second session will be on Tuesday, February 23rd from noon to 2 p.m. And we'll be moving on to some of the discussion around the transportation demand management policies. So we hope everyone can attend the second session as well. And like was just stated, we will share the PDF of the presentation, as well as some of the recording of today if you want to review any session or share it with somebody who was not able to attend but was on the invitee list. So again, feel free to share any immediate feedback via email with us, and we'll see you again in just a couple of weeks. Thanks for your time, everyone, today.